Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the AMU Indonesia project, ISG, Indonesia Study Group. We have to move here because the room that was damaged, and maybe the next ISG will be here or somewhere else. My name is Ridwan Ritular. I'm from the Indonesia project. I would like to start by acknowledging and celebrating the Nanawal and Ngambri peoples who are the traditional custodians of Canberra and pay our respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. This is a hybrid event, and we'll be taking questions from those of you in the room as well as online. Those online can write their question in the Q&A box, and we will read them out. We're very happy today to have Pierre van der Eyck to present. Pierre is not a stranger to SD, has presented a number of times. And Pierre van der Eyck is an associate professor and leader in international business and business history at the Research School of Management, NU. In 2021, the Australian Research Magazine nominated Pierre as Australia's research field leader in economic history, and his areas of research specialization include economic and business development in Indonesia, economic and business history of Australia, European economic integration, and EU-Australia business relations. Today we're going, Pierre is going to talk for 45 minutes. And then followed by Q&A.
Sure. Thank you. Hello everyone, good to see you, and the people watching from home. I'm not going to talk about a very cheerful topic, unfortunately, but I think it's necessary to talk about it, and I'll explain why that is. A reason to talk about this topic is that I'm going to take you back in time quite a bit. In September 1951, many countries from around the Pacific sent representatives to the San Francisco conference. And the purpose of the conference was to sign an international peace treaty with Japan to conclude the fallout from the Second World War in the Pacific, of course. And the expectation was that after signing that agreement, relations between Japan and the nations around the Pacific Rim would be normalized. And Indonesia was represented at that conference. And in a session which was chaired by the Australian Foreign Minister, Percy Spender, Indonesia's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Ahmad Subardjo, said the following, and I quote, the damages which Indonesia suffered during the Japanese occupation are twofold. First, the loss of life, approximately 4 million people, and second, material damages of billions of dollars. And he continued to say that the purpose of this conference my government has the facts and figures on hand and will produce them at the time. The thing is, the Indonesian government has, to my knowledge, never produced those facts and figures. It never published them either. In other words, it remains until today unclear where this number of 4 million victims came from, and what that number of 4 million victims of the Japanese occupation years, 1942 to 1945, is actually based on. But when you think about it, this we must be talking about a major human tragedy, because 4 million victims, that is 8% of Java's population in 1940, 8%. Try to imagine Java's population today and deduct 8%. It's a major human disaster. So, what's behind that number? That's the main reason for this presentation. I'm not going to talk about the reasons, the causes of the 1944-1945 famine. I've published about that a few times, and the last publication was in the UGM journal Lembaran Sejarah in 2020. and my findings were tested and confirmed by Greg Hubb, a colleague at the University of Oxford, who published a whole book on the economy of Southeast Asia during the Japanese occupation years. Instead, I'll be talking about two papers that I've written last year. One on re-estimating the number of victims of the famine, basically trying to ask where does the 4 million estimate, which Subardjo mentioned in 1951 come from? What is it based on? Is it accurate? And if not, what can we do to re-estimate that number using whatever sources have become available since 1951? And secondly, and this is, I think, quite important, why is it that if you read Indonesia's historiography, if you follow public discussion about Indonesia's past, why is this 4 million, this estimate of 4 million, not part of Indonesian historiography, and for that matter, its public memory? So those are the two papers that I've written, and I will draw on those papers, although there's a lot more detail that I will not be able to discuss at this moment. Okay, now, in terms of historiography, it turns out that the estimate of 4 million victims of the famine 1944-45 is somewhat contentious. I was never fully aware of it, to be honest, even though I published in the past on the reasons why the famine unfolded. I was never fully aware of that simply because I thought that Egbert de Vries had done a good job in estimating what he thought would be the 2.4 million victims. Egbert de Vries was an officer in the Agricultural Extension Service of colonial Indonesia in the 1920s. He was a senior public servant in the colonial ministry of, Department of Economic Affairs in the 1930s, and he was arguably Indonesia's first professor of economics at the, well, let's call it the first University of Indonesia during the 1940s. And I thought the estimate of 2.4 million, well, that must be a good job, therefore I've been quoting it over and again. But it contrasts with the number of 4 million. The other thing is that, so I've repeated that number, and to that matter, several other historians have also repeated the estimate by de Vries, sometimes suggesting that I made that estimate. No, I didn't. I just called it de Vries. Now, this is in contrast with historiography in Indonesia, which does acknowledge that there were major problems with food supply and famine in the course of the Japanese occupation years, but it's largely silent about the magnitude of this human tragedy, not making reference to either the 4 million, which Subardjo mentioned in 1951, or for that matter, the 2.4 million victims, which de Vries estimated. I looked at several, quite prominent publications on Indonesia's history, Nagoro and Santo, for example, the semi-official history of Indonesia during the Suharto era, and some later publications, Sujono and several authors, as well as Imran, more recently. Yes, there is some discussion about the human toll during 1942 to 45. Much of that discussion tends to focus on the plight of the romusha. The romusha are about some estimates 2 million Javanese laborers who were forced to work on all kinds of infrastructure projects, which the Japanese military administration initiated, and of whom around about 200,000 perished as a consequence of the very poor conditions under which they had to labor. So, justifiably, the fate of those people is mentioned in Indonesian historiography. It lives on, for that matter. And there are reasons why it lives on, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Contentions. So one issue of contention is that famine victims, that number that I just introduced you to, is not really part of Indonesia's historiography. Where historians have discussed those numbers, we're talking about good colleagues, Aiko Kurosawa and Shigeru Sato, who studied Java's rural society during the Japanese occupation years, and they are very reluctant to go along with either estimate, 2.4 or 4 million. They don't believe that, well, on occasion, there is some indication that they don't believe the estimates to be true. But they don't really specify what is wrong with those numbers. So that's another point of contention. So for that reason, I set out with the two papers referred to identify the origins of the estimate of 4 million and question whether it's reliable or not. And ask the question why that number, that very significant number, again, we're talking about 8% of Java's population in 1940, if true, why that isn't part of Indonesia's historiography and public memory. So I'll come back to those questions a bit. Now, the origin of both estimates actually is not that difficult to explain. Both are based on the registrations of the births, the deaths, and the total population of the Indonesian population at village level in Java. Those numbers were on a weekly basis harvested by public health officials that were based in each kabupaten in Java. They were responsible for making sure that village authorities harvested those numbers. They were also responsible for aggregating those numbers and then sending them up the administrative chain where and they would eventually end up with at the headquarters of the public health service in Jakarta. And there they were aggregated and until 1940 published at kabupaten level, and they were also published in newspapers aggregated to residency level. Well, the residency administrative unit no longer exists, but also in the 1940s, the residency level unit was still being used. So the numbers must have come on which the estimates of the 1944-40, the estimates of the 1944-45 number of victims must have come from the population registration data. Because I'm introducing you here to Prawoto Subardjo. He must have obtained them from the headquarters of the public health service in Jakarta. It's my guess, but I'm almost certain that he got them there in July 1945. So before the Japanese surrender and before, of course, the Republic of Indonesia was declared. And the reason why he obtained those numbers was that he worked as an advisor to the Japanese military government, initially at the Department of Economic Affairs of the Japanese military administration, and during January until August, of course, 1945, he was part of the Central Advisory Council, the Chios Sangiin, which advised the most senior level in the Japanese military administration in Java. He was keenly interested in what was happening, unfolding in rural Java, and I'll explain a bit later why he was so interested. He must have shared those numbers, which he obtained in July 1945, with Egbert de Vries. Egbert de Vries was in a Japanese detention camp during the Japanese war years, and he was released after, of course, the Japanese surrender, most likely in September 1945. And he was then free to roam around Jakarta, not go outside of Jakarta because the security situation would not have allowed that. And going around Jakarta, he must have renewed old acquaintances, including his acquaintance with Prabowo. Because during the 1930s, Prabowo had been a member of the parliament, the parliament of the colonial Indonesia. And in various interactions during parliamentary sittings, he expressed concern about things unfolding in rural Java, got interest in agricultural issues, and that is what he had in common with de Vries. De Vries at that stage was working in the Department of Economic Affairs with responsibility for rice policy, for example, as well as trade policy. And that's where his interests overlap with those of Prabowo. And there are indications that both were in Parliament, in the parliamentary building, that is, at the same time. So they must have known each other. So as soon as de Vries received the birth and mortality numbers for 1943 and 1944 from Prabowo, he must have gone to, at least that's what he describes, the office of the Jakarta residency, where he acquired the monthly birth and mortality data for just Jakarta residency. And he used those numbers going from January to May in order to extrapolate the 1944 numbers for the whole of Java, and therefore come up with an estimate of the degree to which mortality exceeded births in 1945. Yeah, it's a rough guess. Anyhow, he made his estimates, and you can see them here. Well, yeah, good eyesight, that is. His estimate, the Vries estimate, 1943 to 45, the total number of excess mortality, 2.45 million. That's where he got his number from. 1943-44, excess mortality, extrapolating both birth rates and mortality rates into 1945. Doesn't get us to the 4 million, but the 4 million was also part of his estimate, because he argued and he knew the agricultural situation across Java quite well. He had studied it for that matter. And on the basis of talking to people and looking around Jakarta, at least, his impression was that the situation, the food situation, would continue to be quite bad into 1946. And he added an unsubstantiated number of victims during 1946 to say, well, the total number of direct and indirect victims of the Japanese occupation period must be between 3 and 4 million. Okay, 4 million. That number of 4 million, he must have shared with colleagues, former colleagues who started to return to Indonesia, including the head of his department. There he is, Jacob van Hoogstraten. He was the head of the Department of Economic Affairs in the 1930s. He was in Australia, located in Australia as part of the colonial government in exile, continued to be head of the Department of Economic Affairs, and he returned in October 1945 to resume his work as head of the Department of Economic Affairs. And in a press conference on the 19th of October 1945, he mentioned this number of victims, 4 million. And that was picked up by various correspondents for international press agencies, which sent it around the world, and it was picked up by press outlets, newspapers in many different parts of the world, particularly in Australia, but also, of course, in the Netherlands. And that number started to lead a life of its own. And for that matter, it was repeated in Indonesia as well, as far as the newspapers were interested in reporting.
Excuse me, Pierre, I can't read the top bit. Is that a magazine, that source?
Yeah, I'm
You're going to talk. Okay.
getting to
Thanks.
because I mentioned that the numbers must have been collected by Prawoto in July 1945. He must have shared them with De Vries in September 1945. And then the first mention in public was in October 1945 by Van Hofstad. But these numbers were not published until Prawoto had organized his journal, Makmur, and he published in January 26 his estimate, the data that he obtained of the birth and mortality numbers across all the different residencies in Java. And for that matter, the Vries didn't publish them until May. Yeah, could have been. Nevertheless, well before the number of 4 million started to circulate, the details had to wait until, well, January 1946, May 1946. But as soon as that number of 4 million started to circulate, other news outlets published it, not necessarily on the basis of press agency reports, also on the basis of, most likely, details that the Vries shared with journalists that were roaming around Jakarta quite frequently. And all of that indicates that the 4 million number must have come from the Vries calculations on the basis of Prawoto's numbers, which he obtained from the health service in July 1945. Okay, now this number of 4 million circulated. It's continued to circulate. It was repeated over and again in the late 1940s, and it ended up in Subardjo's presentation in San Francisco in 1951. And the point here is that that number of 4 million was part of public knowledge in the late 1940s, up until when Subardjo mentioned it in September 1951. It was repeated in the news, not just Dutch language newspapers, also some Indonesian language newspapers picked it up. So there are numbers behind the estimate of 4 million, at least a number of 2.45 million. But not everyone is immediately convinced that those is likely not to be immediately convinced that those numbers are correct, because we're talking here about the village records, data on deaths and births in villages in Java that were collected since the late 19th century, and for that matter, that were published from 1874 until 1895. And former colleagues here at the ANU, Peter Gardner and Mylene Bui, they have written about those numbers, and basically they concluded that the numbers are very much underestimated. It's difficult to work with them, so they doubt they sowed some doubts about the accuracy of those numbers. But for a while, those numbers were not published anymore. Simply because understanding started to sink in after 1895 and they were too long. But they were revived in 1911 when the Public Health Service, Volksgezondheid, or the took the initiative to try and improve the collection of those numbers and start to use them essentially as a tool for contagious disease surveillance. The idea is simple. Let's harvest those numbers, and if we see an increase in mortality rates in a particular region, and again, those numbers were harvested from village level to kecamatan, kabupaten, residency, and then Java level. If mortality rates increase in a particular region, well, that's a signal for the health officer in the kabupaten to start investigating and prepare measures to contain any outbreak of contagious diseases. So that was the main purpose, and it worked reasonably well. Yeah, it's quite crude, of course, and there is a delay of at least a week, if not a few more weeks. Nevertheless, if there's no other information, this is was used. So the public health officer in each kabupaten in Java would supervise the weekly collection of these data in villages, would then aggregate those data, would send them to the residency office, from where they were sent to the head office in Jakarta, and from there they will be published by the predecessor of PPS in the annual statistical yearbook, and the last publication that we have of these data is for 1940. Now, what about the quality of data? Well, I think it was okay for contagious disease monitoring. A good measure, but in the absence of anything else, well, it's what to work with. But it was already known in the 1920s, 1930s, that the numbers were too low, both in terms of birth rates and in terms of mortality rates. And several publications indicate that the main reason for the estimates to be too low is that infant mortality was poorly captured, was underreported. Infant mortality was underreported both as deaths and as birth. There were reasons for that. I can talk about that later. But the point is underestimated. In 1933, there were attempts to try and improve the registration system, essentially for the purpose of working towards the start of a civil register for Indonesians in Indonesia, because that did not exist up until then. That was the start of issuing birth certificates. Still a potential issue in Indonesia today, but that's where it started. So this improved system was gradually rolled out in the late 1930s. That rollout was interrupted in 1942. It was resumed in 1952 by the new Departemen Kesehatan, and from there by 1956 it was extended to other islands. So the publication of birth rates and mortality, birth rates and mortality rates resumed in 1952. But there were shortcomings with these data, but they were used and they served a purpose. By 1952, as Martha indicated, the rollout was almost complete of the improved death and birth registration system. Some white spots, as you can see, Eastern Indonesia, Eastern Java. So some more work to be done, but by 1956, that apparently was completed, and then the rollout towards other parts of Indonesia started. Okay, but by the early 1960s, the whole system started to crumble. It's difficult to find these numbers, but I found some reports from the Bagian Statistik Departemen Kesehatan for 1964-63, and they are very disappointing. For one thing, because there are many missing, non-reported values. That's what the X's, you can see them here, indicate. Secondly, the numbers of mortality statistics started to drop. Very low levels, in other words, underreporting must have been increasingly a problem. And that makes it very difficult to use these numbers. Peter Gardiner, in his PhD thesis, writes that when doing his field work in the 1970s in Java, he tried to work with was it the demography department at the Bahia Statistic, I think, at the department to find a way of improving those data, and then they just gave up. Yeah. So that was that. But up until 1956, arguably, they're reasonably complete, and I've started to use them in order to work towards re-estimating the number of victims of the famine. So these are the Java averages of birth and mortality rates for the ethnic Indonesian population. And these are averages, weighted averages for all Kabupaten. Here are the mortality rates. Here are Prabowo's numbers for 1943 and 1944. And this is what we know about Java averages since 1952. Birth rates on top, mortality rates at the bottom, and you can see the crossover here in the course of 1943 to 1944. Okay, but that doesn't get us closer to 1944-45. Well, for that purpose, I used the Vries methodology, not only to say something about 1945, but also say something about the other missing years. So what I did is I scanned many online newspapers in Dutch or in Bahasa Malayu, and as well as semi-publications, as well as unpublished materials, for that matter, in order to find birth and mortality rates that apply to particular kabupaten, residencies, or even cities, and then calculate unweighted averages. It's crude, and our colleagues in demography must be shrinking by now. You do that, but in the face of anything else, it's important. I propose to work with, and you can see that those unweighted averages, yeah, they're a bit different from the Java averages in bold, but they point in similar directions. I then used those unweighted averages to extrapolate the weighted averages. And these are my estimates of birth rates and mortality rates in the missing years. And you can see the peak in 1945, a drop in mortality, 1946, still a relatively high level, and then gradually a decrease towards the lower levels of the early 1950s. So that's what I've done in order to work towards a new estimate of the total number of people who fell victim of during the Japanese occupation years. The reason to estimate both birth rates and mortality rates is that I can then separate lower birth rates from higher mortality rates. One view is that others have made estimates of population growth in Indonesia, 1940s, 1950s as well. For example, Kefits and Nicky Sastro working together to make estimates of the size of Indonesia's population and using net population growth numbers to extrapolate the 1930 population census into the future, but to take account of difficulties during the Japanese occupation years. Okay, but what they can only do is estimate net population loss. Net population loss, as in not the number of excess deaths, but the degree to which well, population did not grow as fast as expected. So they can't separate the lower birth rates from the higher mortality rates. On the basis of my estimates, I can now make a distinction between lower birth rates and higher mortality rates. So this is the Cambridge and Subardjo compilation of numbers published in 1954. And basically, I replicated the Vries' estimate here with the lower birth rates and the increasing mortality rates, but I can separate them out. And I'll do that in a second. So we can do that now, except we also have to take account of the fact that both birth and mortality numbers, as well as registered population, are too low. And mortality and birth rates are too low, as I mentioned before, largely due to the underreporting of infant mortality rates. What to do? Well, I took refuge to Subardjo Subardjo's PhD thesis, which was published in 1970, in which he used the outcomes of the 1961 population census in terms of its publication of the 5-year averages by 8 brackets of Indonesia's population in Java. He used that, he made assumptions about life expectancy to take account of young children who had died in the meantime between, let's say, the 1930s and 1961, in order to estimate birth and mortality rates by 5-year brackets. So that's what you see here. 5-year brackets, birth rates, here are mortality rates. But of course, you can't use them in order to separate out what happened from 1943 to 1945. You can also see that these rates are a bit higher than what I estimated on the basis of the rates that were harvested by the Public Health Service. I've then used my estimates to basically extrapolate Subardjo's estimates of birth rates and mortality rates. And then I set out to use those in order to estimate the impact of the famines during 1944 and 1945, come to a better estimate of population loss, either due to lower birth rates or to higher mortality rates. So, oh yeah, of course, this is the same as what I showed previously. The too low estimates of total population, for example, and the too low estimates of birth rates and mortality rates. And this is using Subardjo's PhD thesis and correcting for the fact that those estimates are too low. Now, there is net population loss, but I can now disaggregate it in terms of lower birth rates and higher mortality rates. To come to this table, I recalculated the Vries to start with to come to the conclusion that his estimate of net population loss should have been 2.43 million. But on the basis of his estimates, it's possible to separate it out in terms of higher than normal deaths and missing births, as in births that should have been there but were not there. Possibly because of the separation between men and women, particularly the men that were sent to infrastructure work on infrastructure projects, and therefore were not in a position to, well, think about procreation, but also possibly because of the impact of low food supplies on the fertility of women. Taking to the Subardjo 1954, another estimate by Johannes 1960 also allows an estimate of the net loss of population, but not the separation in terms of higher than normal mortality and lower than normal births. This is the too low estimate, which I created. As you can see, it comes to a net loss of 2.5. In terms of higher than normal deaths, 1.3, and extrapolating Subardjo's 5-yearly estimates on the basis of my estimated birth and mortality rates, I come to this number of excess mortality of 3.4 million as a consequence of higher than normal deaths by 1.9 million. And that's to a large extent, it was during 1945. And the number of missing births of 1.5. That's my estimate. It's still a very high estimate, of course. And that leads me to query how to understand this big number. If it was so significant during 1945, 44 and 1945. Question then is, well, what was really known during those years about the famine conditions that were unfolding in Java? If you look at the publications, the newspaper publications, journal publications, you won't find anything. Essentially because of Japanese censorship. There were no newspaper reports on contentious issues such as the rice purchase system, food shortages, the uprisings in Indonesia in 1944 by peasants farmers who were objecting to the rice purchase system. No reports of malnutrition or famine. Even though at the time food production data were collected, it's just that they were not published. I found them at a later stage at PBS actually.
Where you can find.
And for that matter, mortality and birth rates were not published, even though they were collected. In addition to that, the Japanese military government did not commission any particular reports on the food situation, but knowledge of food shortages must have existed. There are various unpublished reports to indicate that. For example, Subardjo, who was advisor to the Japanese Navy commander, in early 1944, he traveled around Java and he already identified problems with food supply and the consequences of that. And he put it together in an unpublished report in July. Prawoto, the advisor to the Department of Economic Affairs, we've come across him before, he was sent to Indonesia to research the farmer uprisings in April and August to August 1944. And he published, he produced a report in October 1942, which was unpublished. The only publication that I found was by Buntaram. Buntaram Matwatmojo, a medical doctor from Semarang, who was a member of the Childbearing in the Japanese, which was the Japanese appointed parliament. Because Buntaran collected, analyzed, published mortality rates and birth rates in Semarang residency by Kabupaten. He also, for 1942-43, he also went around the hospital in order to collect information about admissions, which he included for September 1943 to February 1944, and he concluded already that the food and public health situation was deteriorating quite quickly, and that mortality rates had started to exceed birth rates in Semarang. There's his publication, and there are pictures of Buntaran and Prawoto. I put them together here, essentially because they were appointed to the Sangyo Kagi, another advisory body, to which other leading Indonesian nationalists were appointed as well. For example, Otto Iskandar, and of course President Sukarno, later President Sukarno, and for that matter Muhammad Hatta, later Prime Minister, and Deputy President. Now, the reason to mention that is that they were called upon to meet as the Sanyo Kagi in order to advise the Japanese military administration on the rice acquisition system. Rice acquisition system for the purpose of accumulating rice for distribution was well below tide in 1944. The Japanese were curious to know what can be done in order to improve it. We know about this committee met in January 1945. Yeah, you can't entirely see it, but I found the minutes of that meeting in India. The president was Sukarno. The discussion was going to be about the acquisition of rice and, for that matter, the rice purchase price. The discussion was wide-ranging, and yeah, essentially, when it comes to identifying reasons for the shortfall in acquisitions, the blame was laid on corrupt local officials and Chinese rice millers that were artificially creating a shortfall in supply, and therefore were the cause of any food shortages. And the discussion was basically concluding, well, there needs to be more control over the rice economy. Although Skandinavia even proposed to control everything. All farmers have to give all the rice to the government, and then they get something back. Completely unrealistic. Very important is the fact that Bung went around to different Kabupaten in Central Java again, in order to, well, for one thing, ask around, but also to accumulate new numbers on mortality rates and birth rates in late 1944. And he concluded that the mortality rate had exceeded the birth rates even more than he had observed in his previous publication. He expressed dismay about that, and Pramoto also expressed considerable dismay about that. They must have realized what these numbers indicate in terms of the human suffering that was caused by the food shortages. But that was it. The meeting concluded because the president redirected everyone's attention to the purpose of the meeting. The conclusion was farmers should hand over more paddy, the price needs to increase a bit, rice mills need to be nationalized, but there was nothing about the unfolding human disaster, even though this would have been an opportunity to, raise the attention of the Japanese military administrators to this unfolding issue, to work towards possible solutions. Now, so there was awareness. There was awareness of the unfolding human disaster at that time, but it was kept behind closed doors because the meeting that I just alerted you to took place behind closed doors. And at a later stage, there was no need to revisit these discussions, and the numbers indicate the unfolding human disaster. But what could not be denied was the very sorry plight of the romusha, as I mentioned before. They started to return after the Japanese surrender to Java. They started to draw attention to their plight. They organized themselves in various Kelompok ex-romusha. They started to organize meetings to draw attention to the plight of the people who had not come home, etc. And that led to their plight to become part of Indonesia's public memory and also its historiography. And that unfolded so far that in 1965 it is very awkward autobiography dictated to C.B. Adams in 1965, Sukarno expressed co-responsibility for the plight of the romusha. But that raises the question: if the romusha are part of public memory, why not the 1944-45 famine victims? Well, the chairman has asked me to wrap up. Essentially, my paper then discusses, and to a large extent, this is inference rather than based on fact, that this is related to the fact that Indonesia, after the San Francisco conference had been wrapped up, started bilateral negotiations in order to arrive at a treaty, which did not come about in 1958 with Japan. And it's very likely that in the context of those discussions, there was no need anymore to raise the human suffering of Indonesians, possibly in order not to offend Japanese counterparts. And the second reason, I think, relates to media censorship in Indonesia, which already started to increase in 1953, and of course, which really became a big issue after March 1957, when President Sukarno reappointed himself as executive president. This was an issue because in 1951, Sukarno sued the Indonesia Raya newspaper for something called feelings, because Indonesia Raya had published a letter from one of its readers, basically holding Sukarno accountable for the deaths of human suffering during the Japanese occupation years. Okay, there's more that I can say about this, but let's see whether there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pick up that short, but you can just leave this here if you want, if you prefer. Yeah, let's open for question and answer. Anyone? Yes, please.
Few areas of thank you. That was amazingly meticulous. And I wish we had more on the conclusions. And simple, I want a simple answer. But and then you can see what. But some distinctions. In terms of impact on public mind and on international negotiations, makes a big difference whether deaths are caused by deliberate action on violence and so forth on the part of the authorities, or whether it's bad luck, whether it's weather. And I think there was a El Nino, if I'm not mistaken, but I'd be glad to hear you talk about that. Whether some of this can be attributed to rice harvest factors. The other thing I wanted to talk about was outside Java. Subardjo claimed this was a figure for Indonesia. I guess the more careful people said this was Java. But there are a lot of people outside Java. And my guess is that things would have been on the whole worse. Firstly, because there was conflict in eastern Indonesia, not least, I'm very curious about the total destruction of Balikpapan by the Australians and other cities that were bombed by the Australians, and with very high percentage of deaths, I think. Nobody ever seems to mention that. Certainly, go to Balikpapan and try to find out. So, but the second factor that might have made the other islands more find is that there were a lot of areas that didn't produce a lot of rice outside plantation districts like East Sumatra, mining districts indeed like East Kalimantan, which would normally have been expecting to import rice from Java, but couldn't do that. So, any clues about those two things and the moral distinction in terms of that?
I published on the causes of the famine, and actually I'm working on another paper which uses rainfall data in order to address this issue. Was there really a bad admin effect that really made this famine worse than in other occasions? Yes, it was 1944 was a year with an extended dry season, but it's not as if the amount of rain that fell in the 1944-45 season was less than had been the case in other years before the 40s, when there were no such issues with food supply and famine. In other words, I don't think the drought during 1944, the extended period, is the main explanation for the famine that unfolded in early 1945. There must be other reasons, and it has to do with something that I've published on already, and it is the very rigid system by which the Japanese tried to acquire, get hold of rice for distribution purposes. They only tried to acquire a limited amount, but the system that they used in order to force farmers to hand over their rice was a significant discouragement for the farmers to produce surplus. That's what they didn't do, and that helps explain why the famine folded. In addition to that, shipments of food supplies, rice, and other foods within Java were prohibited, except for authorized shipments, and that meant that the food market that existed in the 1930s that led to rice, but also other food supplies being traded from surplus to deficit areas within Java, and for that matter, surplus and deficit areas across the whole Indonesia to be traded. And it made the whole of Indonesia self-sufficient in rice, 1940, 41, 42. So I'm not convinced that the El Nino is the main is an important factor to explain this famine, although it is a contributing factor. Indonesia versus Java, yes. It's difficult to say much about the food situation outside Java because, for one thing, there are no before the 1940s, no good data were accumulated on that for that purpose. Except for the internal trade data, yes, you're right. Java was not only self-sufficient in rice for itself, but it also exported rice to other parts of the country. Therefore, there were rice deficit areas in other parts of the country, and the question is, what happened there? Well, it's not unlikely that as soon as, let's say, the tobacco in Subardjo did not have to be harvested anymore because there was no market for it, that those who were normally engaged in tobacco production would use their small plot that they would use for that they had access to anyhow to produce for food, vegetables, things for household purposes, would have extended their use of the land that they would have access to. Nevertheless,
If they could get the land.
well, yes, in principle,
At least Sumatra, the largest claimed all the land and then leased it to the plantations.
the other,
So to grow the rice they wanted, but the peasants had to fight for them.
yes, the land was not used anyhow. It could have been used for that purpose. Plus, of course, in much of Eastern Indonesia, rice was not really staple food. It was tutors that make stable food. So I'm not sure whether the food situation is much worse there. There is another thing there, and that is that the reoccupation of much of East Indonesia started already in 1944, when Allied troops gradually occupied different parts of East Indonesia. And with them came relief supplies, which the colonial government stockpiled in Australia. And those stockpiles were ready to be shipped to Java as well after August 1945. It hadn't been for strikes in Indonesian ports, Java ports, and then strikes in Australian ports.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Pierre. This is fabulous, detailed work. I've got a few comments. Just one, your last slide, which you haven't talked about. I'm really sorry that the one that you just were on. Zhongwei Zhao has done a lot of work on the Chinese families, and he's doing demographic analysis, and I'm sure he would want to talk to you about it. I think he's coming back from Melbourne on Thursday, so maybe you can get together with him and discuss some of that, because he goes into some details about more recent work in China about the consequences of famine. So in terms of the period over the 1940s, it's fascinating to imagine if we had the actual bits of paper and could do some work on the village and other records, what we could get at in terms of age structures. Because what tended to happen was that birth and death rates were published in newspapers and government reports and so forth in ways that concentrated on what are called crude rates, per 1,000 population involved, where what you really want to do is look at what's happening with the age structure. Most of the famine deaths, we would assume, would have come at the very young and very older ages. And those very young age deaths are exactly those that you're saying are being underreported. And it could be that the underreporting is also contributed to by the higher death rates of infant mortality. So infant mortality was falling during the 30s and then rises and then starts to fall again. But even by 1971 census, infant mortality was still relatively high. So the infant mortality rates during the 1940s, we would expect would be huge. It would be good if we could get some students looking at any of the extant statistics still in the hygiene study ward in the Purwokerto area with the where there were model areas for health promotion, which collected data. And my understanding is that some people have been able to find data still being held locally. Now, I mean, that doesn't tell you the picture of Java, but if you can get a picture for what is essentially a Kabupaten area, that'll be a very good insight. I also wonder about the what was happening with the birth rate, because I think Wijoyo's speculation is birth rates fell and then rose again. And the birth rates would have been, if you have the birth rates falling and the death rates rising, where you get that X in one of your graphs, then the famine impacts on pregnant women are going to be quite major, and the numbers of pregnant women dying along with their pregnancies are going to be going up. This whole period of time, I would have thought that students across Java should be out in the field collecting more material for you. And so maybe a lecture tour of Java is in the future.
Yes, assuming that there will be an interest in talking about this. There should be, for reasons which I hear. The paper on well, why does it matter to discuss the famine is exactly premised on this notion that a range of studies are now appearing. I'm not sure that Mr. Zhao, yes.
Don't wait.
But that will be one of many studies that are now probing the impact of the China famine Act 59, 1961. There are many other studies that try to relate that episode to current issues affecting population in China today. And much of that relates to possible transgenerational consequences, if not the genetic effects, the kind of things that happen in a woman's body when she's pregnant, on the offspring, if not the third generation of people. There's nothing like that in terms of interesting imaging, as far as I could see.
But didn't Martin Timmer and his work on Gulung
Yes, but that's Gulung Gidul.
I mean, that was
Yes,
from
there are
the 60s and 70s. But I think he was talking about the health of mothers who had been born during the 40s.
yeah, that's what I was going to say. There are regional studies,
Yeah.
which do go into this, but there's a regional study idea is it possible to generalize that in order to see to what degree this affects population in Java, if not as a whole, today. So that's the motivation. Thank you for raising this. In terms of age structures and collecting birth and mortality rates, yes, I've used several newspapers that where local officials reported, look, it's going better with mortality rates. They're down, the birth rates are up again, or the other way, for that matter. In order to reconstruct the unweighted birth and mortality rates for Java as a whole. It's quite crude, but that's what I try to do. And it's very likely that regional archives across Java, not elsewhere in Indonesia, still are sitting on these numbers. They're sitting on a shelf somewhere, and nobody is looking at them, if they are still there. Because it assumes that local authorities will invest time, effort and money in preserving that material. It could well be that they think it's old paper and it's valuable as old paper. Certainly in the 1960s, that was considerable consideration, yes. But it's in regional offices, and yes, it needs diligent students to go and ask the difficult questions. To be honest, I've tried that already. Because I found that in Yogyakarta, in the archive, the local archive in Yogyakarta, it does have mortality and birth rates for the 1950s, and it's possible that it also has improved at a lower administrative level for the 1940s still. The problem then was, no, I can't have access to it. So I tried to hire someone in Indonesia again. To do it, but no access either, because those records are still closed. Yeah, so it's maybe difficult to organize, but perhaps a lecture tour may help. Thank you for the suggestion.
So, wait, is there online?
Thanks, Veron. Just Pierre, coming back to your whodunit missing millions side of the discussion, you mentioned the Japan-Indonesia reparations discussions in the 1950s. I don't quite understand why the Indonesian side had gone soft on a figure at all, whether it was 4 million or 2.4 million, when they're discussing reparations.
Good question, thank you. It relates to a discussion, a public discussion in Indonesia, in the lead up to the San Francisco conference. Subardjo did not have authority to put his signature on behalf of Indonesia until almost he was in San Francisco and he was still waiting for the permission to put his signature. The discussion in Parliament was very heated for several reasons. One of the reasons was there needs to be compensation for human suffering. Okay. The problem with that was that, for one thing, it's very difficult to quantify. And as far as I know, it was not quantified in any estimates of the damage which the war years had created. Because that was not part of the instructions which the United Nations handed down to different the authorities in different countries that had been occupied by the Japanese when it came to estimating damages. Eventually, those damages estimates were never used, also those for Indonesia, but that never included any estimates of for human of the cost of human suffering or compensation. Nevertheless, 1951, there was discussion in Parliament in Indonesia. Subardjo should not sign if there's no guarantee that there will be compensation for human suffering. The compromise was any compensation will be discussed in bilateral discussions after the San Francisco conference. The San Francisco conference was called, and it was explicitly mentioned we are not going to discuss compensation payments. That will have to be settled in bilateral discussions afterwards. Okay. So that compromise was accepted, Subardjo signed, and the next step was then to get together in order to, in a bilateral sense, discuss compensation payments. Now, all of that occurred behind closed doors. I can't go back to my slide, but it happened behind closed doors, and we don't know exactly how Indonesia's claim was substantiated. But last year I found an archive document in the United States which defined this. That the war damage was estimated to be $17.5 billion US worth. Well, doesn't mean very much today. At that time, that was enormous, and it was unimaginable that that could be lodged as a claim on Japan. Japan would never be able to pay that. And that document that I found did not include a line item for human suffering. So the argument was never used. In other words, it was not necessary anymore to mention, yeah, look, 4 million victims and they need to be compensated because it wasn't going anywhere. Wow.
Thank you, Pierre. The first question is that we're using a lot of material from the Indonesian side. Is there, just curious, is there any material that could be available from the Japanese side? I mean, this big tragedy, you know, those Japanese military most likely send something to the headquarters telling what situation, because it could be also related to some unrest, you know, so there's a lot of incentive. So what happened with those communication, if that is available, or you thought that it doesn't available? Second is that on the implementation of this handing out rice to the Japanese authority, do you have any data on the location of Japanese military? How many troops are in certain area? So then you could actually estimate the compliance of those policy. And number 3 is actually Ahmad Subardjo is somebody that is relatively very close to the Japanese, isn't it? Because he the one that communicate closely with the Japanese related to the independence. So I suppose that during that era there should be others that might be much stronger in terms of claiming that the Japanese should compensate. And is there any trace who are the others that actually AKI most likely? Yeah.
They didn't seem
Yeah.
to get their views.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Japanese materials, well, I think not. For one thing, the historians of rural Java during the Japanese occupation years, Hirosake and Aiko Kurosawa, if anyone must have been looking for and also find materials, it must have been them, because they would have had access to the materials in Japan and be able to read as well. It seems very unlikely that this kind of issues were reported after the chain all the way to Tokyo. For one thing, these are not military affairs. It's only the military government responsible to the military authorities back in Japan. And thirdly, why would they? This is something, it's difficult to gauge. I mean, birth and mortality statistics were produced, even agricultural production statistics were produced, but they were accumulated and became available in Jakarta with a significant delay of time. My guess is 4 to 6 months. In other words, the food production data for 1945 would not have become available until late in 1945, like the Japanese had already surrendered at that time. Therefore, no, it wouldn't have been part of the reporting, I think. Distribution, location of the Japanese troops. No, most of the distribution was actually required. Most of the rice that was accumulated was acquired for distribution. Was used for distribution to the civilian population in urban areas. Because there was effectively no free trade of rice anymore by 1944-45. Especially the urban population would have suffered if there was no distribution system. Distribution to the urban population, plus, of course, Japanese troops. But Japanese troops by 1944-45 in Java were relatively limited. Most of them were fighting elsewhere.
Yeah, but they had to be paid.
Yes, well, that was there. The acquisition for the purpose of feeding the Japanese army was a small amount, was a small proportion of the rice that was required for distribution locally. Not only in urban areas, also to the detainment camps, detention camps. We know more about the distribution activities, and that's part of the previous publications that I've done on the difficulties with food supply during the different occupation periods and the later 1940s. Ahmad Subardjo, well, he was without a job after signing the San Francisco Declaration. Not too long after there was a change of government. He was no longer Minister of Foreign Affairs, and for the better, the discussions about reparations payments were dealt with by representatives who were not ministers. So the delegation leader was Rwanda. But what was discussed behind closed doors in Japan, I'm not quite sure, except for the one document that I found in his archive in the United States of a US observer who received the war damage estimate of 17.5 billion from a Japanese counterpart. That had come from the Indonesian delegation. So, but Subardjo was not negotiating with Japanese. Others were doing that. And to all intents and purposes, it looks like they had great difficulties convincing the Japanese to admit to a support package. After all, the support package that Indonesia agreed to in 1958, early 1958, was the equivalent of 800 million US dollars, rather than the 70.5 billion that they were perhaps hoping for in 1951. And that was not for alleviating the human suffering as a consequence of the inflation years. For example, the Serena department store was built as part of this support package. It was agreed in 1958. And that was great for Jakarta. And several big hotels, Hotel Indonesia, but also in Bali and Palawan Ratu. Those hotels were built with, from the Japanese support package. Not quite benefiting the people who suffered of consequences of the climate.
Pierre, thank you very much. It's remarkable how you can piece together a huge amount of information. It must have been such a small. I'm sure. I'm sure. But it must have been a painstaking just to collect it, let alone interpret it analytically. So if Angus Madison was here, he'd be very proud of you.
So it would be interested in GDP.
You can't have everything, can you? Pierre, so Pierre, just it may not be relevant, but what's happening to regional and global food markets over this period? And I assume that I shouldn't know this, but I guess Indonesia was a largely insulated economy, I guess. But weren't the Japanese also, a bit like what Tony was saying, weren't the Japanese extracting a rice surplus for elsewhere as they, you know, as they took over the whole region? I thought there was some, Malaya, for example. I thought there was quite a bit of that going on, but I don't hear it in your story. And please forgive me, I sort of like more of a bottom line. The whodunit somewhere. I know it's really hard, but you've got all the elements of the story, but putting together the jigsaw puzzle, you know, you've got this Japanese occupation, you've got restrictions on the movement of goods and people, you've got unreliable statistics, the breakdown in the statistical collection service, maybe you've got a bit of dry season famine story. So just wondering if you can, you know, this is me being impatient. The bottom line.
I've done that already.
Yeah, maybe I missed it. I got lost in something.
Yes,
But it's terrific.
My first thoughts on this were published on the famine that is and how it relates to the food markets, international food markets that existed, regional food markets, more importantly, in the 1930s. I published on that. 25 years.
Sorry, I must have.
Yeah, most people have missed it. Don't worry. And these papers are not really about explaining the fact.
Okay.
I think I've done that already.
Okay.
It's not, yeah, maybe it's necessary to repeat it, but I've chosen just to insert some references. In terms of the region during the Japanese occupation years, it was difficult to ship materials. The Japanese had great expectations in terms of using Indonesia as a supply base for wherever Indonesia's raw materials, if not food products, were needed elsewhere in the region. It didn't quite happen for all kinds of reasons, related to difficulties of organizing supplies, shipments, etc. There was a war. And that also happened at sea. Some rice indeed was shipped from Java to other parts of Indonesia for one thing, and some rice for that matter was mobilized elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And Greg Huff has identified some of those sequences.
And we have data on that, do we?
Yeah,
Sort of.
No, it's bits and pieces.
Yeah.
But it's, as far as indications go, and you really have to read Greg's book, it's all pretty marginal in terms of food shipments. After all, shipping space was in short supply. Sure. And there were more urgent needs for shipping space for military purposes than for shipments of food supply.
What was the global rice price doing?
Doesn't
May not be relevant, just curious.
It doesn't matter because
Yeah, there wasn't much trade.
the rice price in Indonesia would have risen, certainly in nominal terms, enormously. That doesn't mean that the market would work in terms of mobilizing rice, I don't know, here in Australia, perhaps. After all, Australia was already producing some rice for shipment to Indonesia.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious.
It was not possible.
Yeah.
But you think Thailand maybe
That's a better example to use.
that's why the railway was still working to ship it to Singapore.
Yes, some were shipments as well. Nevertheless, it didn't mean that came all the way to Java to India.
And
Okay,
Japan,
the famine was
sorry.
in 1945, when things were really going from bad to worse for maybe the fallout of the famine was the last thing on there.
And Japan was largely self-sufficient in rice, was it?
No. Japan relied very much on rice shipments from Taiwan, and especially from South Korea. Yeah. No, it was not self-sufficient.
But not from Java.
No, not from Java, a different type of rice.
Yeah.
No, not the favorite type of rice,
Yes.
unless we're very hungry.
Which they probably were. Yes, and thanks, Pete. Very good.
Right, I think we're almost run out of time, so I didn't get you the chance to close your presentation. You want to say something else, or otherwise?
Perhaps just to reiterate the motivation of paper, does it matter? Yes, it does matter in the context of all kinds of studies that are now coming out, drawing attention to the lasting effects of famine conditions in the past. And there's no discussion about that being relevant to the case of Indonesia. Maybe it's necessary that will that starts. So I'm not too interested in the who done it, more in terms of why is it relevant to think about it?
Yeah. And that would increase the international attractiveness of the paper. You're going to send it to an international journal, these comparisons.
Well, also.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.